So good afternoon, colleagues. We're a bit thin on the ground by way of members, but I'll just start by Mr. Allard was cut off when he was questioning before lunch, and other people didn't get a chance to put their questions at all, for which I apologise. But Mr. Allard raised a very fair point that it was unclear to new members how you indicated that you wished to speak or put a question. And you know, of course, having been 15 years in this Parliament, one forget. Well, you get used to the procedures. So, can I just indicate to members that whenever an item starts and the chair opens that item, then from that moment onwards, you are welcome to raise your name plate and indicate to the Secretariat that you wish to be added to the list. It is normal for the chair always to take the coordinators. That's why they've been elected, and they get special treatment. You can argue with them in your own group about that. But then the list will usually be done on the basis of first come, first served. Yeah. Is it not?
Rapporteurs and shadow
rapporteurs. Yeah, with obviously rapporteurs and coordinators get special treatment. But thereafter, it's done more or less in the order of which you've notified. And of course, if the list gets too long, the chair may well say, OK, you know, if you haven't indicated within the first 5 minutes, then we'll cut off the list at that point. So get in early and just indicate. Right, OK. And so on that score, I'm going to turn to the Fisheries Control Regulation. I suppose at this point you immediately start indicating that at some point you'll wish to speak on this. OK. Now, this regulation was introduced by the Commission during the last mandate, quite a while ago, really. And although preliminary work was done on it by the S&D, it never actually came to a vote in committee. So we start all over again with the S&D having the lead, although I don't think they've yet named the rapporteur. So I would like to introduce Mrs. Vates from the Commission to talk to and explain the control regulation. I think it likely that the majority of members have not actually read it. So, you know, you really are, you know, explaining it from first principles. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, honourable members of the European Parliament. We are actually very happy to have the opportunity today to present you in a hopefully pedagogic way the revision of the control system, which of course has a certain complexity. So we really hope that our presentation will help you to understand the Commission's proposal. So for explaining the things to you, we will do a PowerPoint presentation. That's also the reason why we are sitting here and not up there. And it will be a shared presentation by me and by Francesca. And before doing so, allow me to introduce ourselves. It's the first time that you see our faces for most of you. So my name is Veronika Feitz. I'm Director in DG Mare, dealing with the Common Fisheries Policy, including the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund, including the control regulation, and including the implementation in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. And Francesca Arena is head of unit dealing with control and inspection in DG Mare. So let's have a look at the first slide. Francesca? So this slide is a graphic presentation which tries to show you visually that monitoring, surveillance and control is the backbone and the foundation of the Common Fisheries Policy. You have on top the Common Fisheries Policy with the objectives and the principles laid down in the basic regulation. In the middle, you see that those principles and objectives are implemented via conservation measures such as fishing opportunities, multi-annual plans and technical measures. And it shows also that those measures, the conservation measures, they are based on scientific advice. And the basis of the scientific advice are data. And the data are partly scientific data, but they are also data arising from the monitoring and the control of the fleet in terms of catch and effort data. But what I can say, you can have the best conservation measures. They will not work if they are not respected and if their implementation is not sufficiently controlled. So conservation measures will only have an impact, the real impact and the wanted impact, if they are implemented by the industry and if they are properly controlled. So overall, the purpose of the fisheries control system is to contribute to the objectives of the common fisheries policy, namely to ensure sustainable fisheries. And it does so by mainly three activities. One activity is to monitor the fishing activities. So this is about knowing who is fishing, when, what, and how much. This is an important dimension of the fisheries control system, as it provides critical information to fisheries managers to make informed decisions on the management of the fish. It provides also data to the fisheries scientists, which is essential to undertake proper stock assessments and provide recommendations to the fisheries managers for managing fisheries. The second strand of actions under the Common Fisheries Regulation is to have mechanisms in place that ensure that the fishermen respect the rules and that they prevent unlawful behavior by the fishermen. And this means we need dissuasive and deterrent mechanisms such as sanctions in case of wrongdoings and shortcomings. And the third strand of action is the prevention and the combating illegal, unregulated and unreported fishing, the so-called IUU fishing. I will not go very much into that strand of action because you will have a point later this afternoon also on the agenda. So what is the current legal basis of the fisheries control system? And you will see four main complementary pillars. You have on the one hand to the left-hand upper side the Fisheries Control Regulation, which dates back to 2009. That was at that time a major overhaul of all the control rules that we had in place. But there is to the right-hand side also the IUU regulation, which dates back to 2008. And on the bottom to the left, you have the EFCA founding regulation. So that's the regulation which provides the founding rules for the European Fisheries Control Agency, which is our agency that helps to coordinate the control efforts of our member states. And last but not least, you have to the right-hand side on the bottom the sustainable management of the external fleet. That's legislation we have reviewed in 2017, and this is about essentially regulating our fleet in external waters or external fleet in our waters. To this has to be added a kind of high number of other legislative tools where you see here and there some control measures in place. These are the Mediterranean regulation, deep sea regulation, some multi-annual plans include some control provisions, and last but not least, there are control provisions arising from international negotiations in the context of regional fisheries management organizations. So, a quite extensive legal framework. But as for all legislation, it is good from time to time to look into its efficiency and effectiveness through a thorough evaluation. And that's what the Commission did in 2017. We issued an evaluation report of the control regulation. But that's also what the European Court of Auditors did in 2017. And as a result, the court issued a report which is called EU Fisheries Control, More Efforts Needed. To these evaluations needs to be added the 5 years evaluation of the European Fisheries and Control Agency. And also this forum here, the European Parliament, adopted a resolution in 2016 on how to make the fisheries controls in Europe uniform. So you have a broad number of evaluations and assessments over the past couple of years. And what you can see from all those evaluations and assessments is that there is concurrence in the view that the control system as it currently stands is not entirely fit for the purpose. All these assessments hint to 4 areas where improvements are necessary. One is that the provisions for the collection of fisheries data, and in particular the data from small-scale fisheries and from recreational fisheries, are inadequate and not enough. And as a consequence, we have a situation where the fisheries data are not sufficiently complete, they are not sufficiently available, and are not sufficiently reliable. The second area for improvement is enforcement. And what the evaluations found very clearly is that there is an uneven enforcement of the control rules by the member states. And that of course, jeopardizes a level playing field among operators. For instance, to give you an example, there are different levels of sanctions applied in different member states for the same type of infringement. Yeah? So that creates really an uneven playing field for operators. A third area for improvement is that the control system as it currently stands is not in line with the new common fisheries policy which entered into force in 2014. And this is particularly the case for the control of the landing obligation. And you will remember that our Director General Machado was talking about this in particular. And the fourth area of improvement is that the current rules are considered overly complex, with too many derogations that are difficult to control, and a lack of clarity of certain provisions. So in the light of all these evaluations and recommendations, it was very clear for us as in the Commission that inaction was simply not an option. It's the reason why we prepared a proposal for the revision of the control system based on a thorough impact assessment, and that proposal was adopted by the end of May 2018. And since then, it has been in discussion by co-legislators. What does this proposal do? It's, to be clear, it's not a repeal. We have not repealed the current system because we didn't want to lose the investments made by the industry and by the sector in control tools and control mechanisms. We have amended the current system where we thought it was necessary to be amended. And these amendments concern, in essence, three main regulations: the Fisheries Control Regulations, the EFCA Founding Regulation, and the IUU Regulation. But there are some small amendments also to other regulations, namely the Mediterranean Regulation and the Baltic Multi-Annual Plan. So in a nutshell, that's the context, that's the background for the revision of the control system. And Francesca will now present you, hopefully also in a nutshell, the main content of all these amendments. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I will now guide you through the proposal by focusing on the key specific amendments and areas which have been regrouped into enforcement rules, data, availability, quality and sharing, issues where we needed to bridge the gaps with the common fisheries policy, increase synergies with other policies, and the last 2 points will be the amendments to the EFCA founding regulation and to the IUU regulation. One important issue to stress from the outset is that across the whole proposal we tried as much as possible to clarify existing rules, to simplify the provisions, although this was rather a challenge, being this a very complex set of legislation, and to phase out paper in all sorts of reporting obligations and move to digitization. As well, the regulation is also aligned to the Lisbon Treaty. So, starting with the enforcement rules, there are a number of proposed amendments by the Commission, but I'll focus mostly on sanctions. This is an area where we focused a lot of attention, and the first notable change is that we are proposing to combine all provisions concerning sanctions and infringement in one regulation. That will be in future the control regulation, moving the current provisions, provision currently laid down in the IUU regulation into the control regulation. This will bring much more clarity and streamline the application of the enforcement chapter. We are also proposing an updated list of what should be serious infringements per se. Today, this is not the case. There is a list of serious infringement per se, but on other serious infringements, it is left to the discretion of the member states, and the result, the way the infringements are interpreted is a different one. Attached to this list of serious infringement, we have also proposed harmonized criteria to be used so to qualify as serious certain other infringements of the CFP rules that will not be serious infringements per se. So all in all, this will bring a better harmonization and level playing field across the sector. We are also introducing mandatory administrative sanctions and a minimum level of fines, which does not exist today for serious infringements. The reason being is that today many member states still recur only to the criminal system, and it leads to very lengthy procedures that may last 2-3 years. So what we are suggesting is that in any case there should be a mandatory administrative sanction that can also be accompanied by criminal proceedings depending on the criminal system of the member states. We bring clarity into the immediate enforcement measures after the identification of a potential infringement, and also we try to improve the exchange of data that is still very lacking today between member states on sanctions and infringement. The second big chapter is data availability, quality and sharing. Here we worked to improve the availability and quality of data for all types of vessels, starting from what are normally defined as small-scale vessels, vessels below 12 meters, that are today subject to a number of derogations under the current rules, to the point that, for example, vessels below 10 meters do not have to submit any type of catch data according to the legislation. So what we are proposing for those vessels is to use a mandatory tracking, so to follow the position of the vessel, but also to have an electronic system for reporting of the catches, with having in mind that there are a number of simple tools that have been developed lately for those vessels that can be used instead of those more heavy tools used by bigger vessels. For vessels above 12 meters, we remove the existing derogations. There are a number of derogations today applying to vessels up to 15 meters, including for the tracking of those vessels. So we propose that no more derogation in futures, all vessels will be tracked and all vessels will have to report electronically their catches. A notable change in the text we have proposed concerns the article on recreational fisheries. This article is today extremely weak when it comes to control, and it is very difficult to understand what is the pool of participants in recreational fisheries, let alone to know the quantity of catches. So what we have proposed is that each member state will set up a registration or license system at national level without specifying how this should work. It is left to the member states. And member states will also put in place a data collection system or a registration system on catches for all types of catches. For those species that are subject to conservation measures at EU level, we propose to establish an electronic reporting system similar to the one applying for small-scale vessels. Concerning data, we also removed a number of derogations. It is important to stress that today, if a vessel catches less than 50 kilograms, there is a derogation for reporting. We have removed that derogation, which is no longer consistent with the fact that small-scale vessels will have to report their catches in future. We have also adapted the derogations for sales and adapted the rules on tolerance between catch estimates by the master and landed quantities. I'm not entering into the details here because it can become very, very technical. For data, it is also important to realize that the reliability of the weighing of catches is essential to have good data on how much resources has been extracted from the sea. And there we noticed that the current rules are not fit for purpose today. What we are proposing is that all fisheries products are weighed at landing and by registered operators. That can be masters, it can be buyers, so any type of operator that is registered by the member states. However, we also propose specific procedures for unsorted landings where it is impossible to weigh catches by species at landings. And we try to clarify the responsibility and accountability of operators at weighing, transport and sales. The third big chapter is bridging the gap with the CFP, and here we worked on two main issues. The first one is the landing obligation. Today, although the landing obligation is in place, there are no strict control rules on how to control the landing obligation. We are proposing a mandatory use of closed circuit television, so cameras, applied to individual vessels and fleet segments based on risk assessment, so only high-risk vessels. The implementation should be done by the member states and should be agreed at regional level in order to ensure a level playing field. We also proposed a number of improvements on the control of the fishing capacity. There are rules today in the control regulation of fishing capacity, but they're highly ineffective and not really implemented as they should be. We are proposing to simplify the system for the control of the fishing capacity by a continuous monitoring and recording of engine power for certain types of vessels. We are also translating a number of recommendations of the European Court of Auditors on the physical verification of the tonnage. Moving to the fourth chapter, we also try to improve the synergies with other policies, and notably the environmental policy is one on which we worked. We worked on the reporting of lost fishing gears and mandated in future an electronic reporting of lost gears via the logbook. Today the reporting is not done via the logbook and in many cases we realize that there is no reporting happening in a number of member states. So we hope that with this provision the reporting will be easier. We also proposed a new and much wider definition of fishing restricted areas, which will include any types of fishing restricted area, including marine protected areas at member state level, EU level, and wider. By the way, it is important to stress that the new rules on the vessels tracking will significantly improve the monitoring and control in fishing restricted areas, which today is challenging in many cases because those vessels cannot be tracked. So it's difficult to know whether or not they're fishing or whether or not they're entering the area. We also worked on improvement of the synergies with the food law and in particular to have better traceability in future by making sure that there will be a clear link between each fishing trip and the lots of fishery products that are placed on the market. This is not the case today. We also extend the provisions on traceability of fisheries products to imported products and notably to prepared or preserved fish and crustaceans, which today are totally derogated from the traceability provisions. And last but not least, we propose to move to a digitalization of the information and to phase out paper-based systems for traceability. So these were the main modifications for the control regulation. Moving to the EFCA funding regulation, here the amendments have been really targeted in a way to ensure that the EFCA mission and objectives are fully aligned to the CFP, including the external dimension of the CFP. We propose as well an extension of the geographical scope of the agency's inspection powers that today are limited only to international waters, but not to union waters. And we also extend the possibilities for revenues of the agency in line with other agencies. Last but not least, we propose an amendment to the IUU regulation The first one concerns the catch certificate, which is the certificate necessary for imported produce to be imported into the EU. This catch certificate today is still a paper certificate, and we are moving gradually to a digitization of the catch certificate, but we need to have a legal basis. So this text is providing that legal basis. And I remind again that the provisions concerning enforcement currently in the IUU regulation will be moved, or have been moved, proposed to be moved to the control regulation. Just a word on the date of application that the Commission has proposed. We propose that the changes to the EFCA foundry regulation are immediate, just after the entry into force. However, for all other amendments, there will be a need to adopt necessary secondary legislation, meaning implementing undelegated acts. Also, there will be a need to develop ICT tools, notably for the reporting of small-scale vessels. So we are proposing an entry into force 24 months, a date of application, of 24 months after the entry into force of the regulation. I think that you're all aware of the co-decision procedure that was said right at the beginning by the chair. What's the state of play in the European Parliament? In the Council, the examination of the proposal is currently ongoing in the working group on internal and external fisheries, and the only outstanding chapter for the presentation, technical presentation, is sanctions and enforcement. On our website, we uploaded all types of material that one would need to understand the basics and the rationale behind the proposal, the impact assessment, the consultations, the report by the Commission. This is the link to be used. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Commission, for taking us through that. The S&D group will be taking on the file. Mrs. Aguilera, I think, has indicated that she will be the rapporteur. I'm going to just hand over to Mr. Matich in a moment to put a question. Can I just put one question myself first, which is on the proposal for the minimum level of fines? A very necessary proposal. However, you must be getting pushback from the Council on the grounds of interference in national criminal law or judicial independence or what have you. In tabling that proposal, what was the result of consultations?
When it comes to the, thank you, Chair, for giving me the question. When it comes to the discussions in the Council, we are still at the very early stage, going article per article through the regulation. So there is not yet an established position by the Council that we could reflect here or report to you. So you will have to be patient. They continue the discussions of the control regulation, but they are not yet that advanced. But just to react, of course, what we hear from the member states here and there is that we should not intervene into issues which are considered to be of their competence. That's not the intention of the proposal. The intention of the proposal is to have administrative proceedings across the board. And then, in addition, the member states can, if they wish, add also criminal proceedings according to their rules and procedures.
Yes, as you know, the Commission has produced in the past reports which indicate that when it comes to the enforcement of environmental legislation and issues of this kind, not only are there hugely different applications of the enforcement procedure, but when it comes to the national courts, the penalties vary enormously from negligible to proper sanctions. So I understand where you're coming from, but I also understand the difficulty of applying such a proposal. Mr. Matich, wish to take the floor?
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, I will be speaking on behalf of my colleague Clara Aguilera. First of all, she would like to thank our colleague Isabel Thomas, member of the S&D group from the previous legislative term, for her work and dedication to this file. As you all probably know, she wisely decided to interrupt the process of this dossier in order to achieve a better quality in the European Parliament position of this important topic. Clara accepts the challenge of being rapporteur for this important reform, and she would like to express to you her hope that we will manage to reach a consensus agreement so that we have a position of strength in relation to the other European institutions. To this end, the process must start again from the beginning. In other words, she will write a new draft report, which will be presented into the Committee of Fisheries, and then there will be a deadline for tabling amendments. Each political group can consider whether to reintroduce the amendments already tabled or whether to present new modifications to the European Commission's proposal for regulation. The timetable and deadlines have not yet been set, but would like to make it clear that she will take the time to be able to make all these required consultations and hold all the indispensable debates in order to achieve a quality position for the European Parliament. Clara would like to apologize for not being present at this first debate of this dossier, but it is impossible for her to be at two parallel meetings. In this case, she is at Agri meeting. As you know, a public hearing of the Fisheries Control Time has been set, which will take place at the Fisheries Committee meeting in October, and on that occasion we will have enough time to hold a proper debate. On this occasion, Clara doesn't want to go into too much detail, but at least she would like to say that she believes it is necessary to complete and modify the proposal in the sense of the objective of simplification demanded by the Parliament, and on the other hand, she would like to highlight the harmonization necessary in order to not to create a feeling of injustice amongst fishermen of the different member states. Furthermore, it is necessary to support the creation of specific financing and control mechanism for recreational fishing and to include provisions to reflect the specific characteristics of aquaculture and ultra-peripheral regions. Colleagues, we have before us the major challenge of strengthening the current system of fisheries control and inspection in the European Union without resulting in an increase in the administrative burden and additional efforts for the member states. Clara believes the modernization and use of new technologies must create the objective of increasing the control of recreational fishing, of the landing obligation or to promote even more first sale and traceability, as well as exchange of data between the member states, the European Commission and the European Fisheries Control Agency itself, but also with the third countries in all sense and areas. Many thanks to all of you.
Thank you. Mr. Mian-Mon.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I'm glad that we've begun with this particular dossier, which is very important, and I had the opportunity to familiarize myself with it in the previous legislature because I was one of the shadow rapporteurs. I think indeed it's extremely important to take into consideration the valuable work that was done by the rapporteur during the previous legislature. Now, there are a number of brief comments I'd like to make, but I won't go into length with regard to this. I just simply wanted to touch upon them. First of all, I'd like to thank the Commission for their presentation. It's very complex indeed. It requires a lot of study. It is a text which is extremely important. Furthermore, just as Clara believes, I think the having some sort of homogeneous across-the-board system of sanctions, some sort of balance, indeed, is extremely important. This directive, as it is right now, hasn't been incorporated properly into national legislation. It's been done in a very fragmented fashion. So there is great discrepancy between the various member states as far as the implementation of sanctions. So I do feel that a new regulation ought to be one which creates an equal playing field, a level field, so to say, that equal, similar type of implementation throughout the member states as well. There's something else that I'd like to draw your attention to. I think that as far as control and introduction of new technologies, etc., I think it's very important that we don't create additional bureaucratic burden and red tape. I think we ought not forget that we're speaking about a sector which is extremely traditional, and all of this new technology and newfangled things that were introduced create a certain amount of lack of trust, problems, discomfort, and so on and so forth. And then there's the issue of the cost as well. Now, as we heard from Mr. Machado this morning, the closed circuit systems, the cameras, and so on and so forth, that involves, of course, the various management procedures. Here, I think, as well, we have to be rather careful. We have to take into consideration rather the idiosyncrasies, the places where people work and live, the utility of this type of camera system, and we have to ask whether all of the taping, all of this filming will also serve its particular purpose as well. Now, also the risks, for example, the vessels that are longer than 18 meters, that they may not meet the various obligations that are there. So it is rather complicated as well. So I think indeed, to a certain extent, this has to be looked at very, very closely, as does the issue of quotas. The quotas are there, the quotas are fixed, but frequently there's an issue of security as well, and safety as well. And I think that those issues are to be looked at as the other issues as far as monitoring and controlling. Of course, for the member states, it's going to be very, very difficult because fisheries is a very, very large and diverse sector. Creating the necessary control systems is not going to be easy at all. But from the quantitative point of view, I think indeed greater control ought to be there. But of course, we have to be very, very careful about how all of this is implemented. And then as far as catches, indeed, I do agree that there has to be, once again, a system which is balanced and also a system where all member states are basically subject to the same set of sanctions, that these sanctions are implemented in the same fashion. Once again, I'd like to thank you. I'm very sorry for the very summary fashion that I made my presentation, but undoubtedly we'll have the opportunity in the future when we discuss the various key points in greater detail. We'll be able to go into greater profundity with regard to the various issues. Thank you very much.
Grazie. La proposta del regolamento.
Well, we've seen the lack of proper implementation of policies of the European Union, and this doesn't only apply to fisheries as well. And also the issue here is sustainability of resources. I think it's very important to improve the control as far as fisheries is concerned for sustainability purposes. Now, the proposal for a regulation looks, of course, at the idiosyncrasies, but I think greater attention has to be paid to the idiosyncrasies of the Mediterranean region, where we have small fleets, small vessels as well, and where it becomes very difficult in certain instances to implement the various norms. Now, all the various different controls as far as
di costi a carico delle imprese per il controllo.
As far as the landings, and of course we have to look at the various specificities there. Also, the various difficulties as far as implementing as well, particularly taking into consideration the financial burden that exists. Once again, the idiosyncrasies of the Mediterranean have to be taken into consideration. Also, national norms with regard to controlling the whole series of systems that are in place. I think it is indeed the issue of putting some sort of an electronic database, electronic controls as well. This may allow for a better system overall and better management. But of course, there is the particular issue where the financing will come from and how all of this will be implemented in the end. Now, the sanction system and the fragmentation of it, of course, creates a number of different issues. It's very, very difficult to have a clear view of the landscape overall, the diverse situation as well. And once again, the implementation of these sanctions is an issue, of course, which has to be taken up as well. Also, implementing sanctions at the moment of the committing of some sort of infraction or shortly thereafter is something which is questionable as well. Now, I think indeed we need the proper cooperation. A concerted effort has to be made with colleagues from the Commission in order to put together a regulation which is most effective. Thank you.
Bonjour, merci de me donner la parole.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for giving me the floor. A couple of questions. We are looking at the review of the control regulation, and we would like to emphasize a number of the issues in the control regulation that require attention. Transparency has to be key in any future regulations. Without transparency on the sanctions and why they've been given, then we can't do anything. So is the Commission going to start to publish its audits on how member states are applying the rules under the control regulation? That's my first question. Also, the control regulation has been in place for 10 years now, but a very few member states have implemented effective deterrent sanctions. There is a very low rate of sanctions, and they don't meet the criteria set out in the control regulation and the IUU regulations. In 2017, the Commission itself recognised in a report that the implementing measures, particularly when it comes to sanctions and the point system and follow-up for infringements, are areas where there are shortcomings. Member states are supposed to implement the control regulation and the IUU regulation, but there are very few sanctions. And so what is the Commission going to do about this problem? Can the Commission explain how it intends to improve the situation in the future? And are you going to take strong measures against member states, such as infringement procedures or suspending financing under the EMFF?
Thank you. Very specific questions. Mr. Bilbao.
Gracias, presidente.
Thank you very much. And I would like to thank the Commission as well for the various explanations that have been provided. And we all indeed share the view that this is a relatively complicated report. It was so in the previous legislature as well. I wasn't involved in this in the previous legislature, but I am aware of the complications that were involved. Now, indeed, first of all, we have the data with regard to fisheries is incomplete, and also the implementation is very spotty, and also very great differences between the member states as well. Now, the collection of data and the level of that and the various differences between the member states, I think it's very important to have some sort of correction of this particular issue, because certain efforts may be made in order to improve the regulation and improve implementation of European Union legislation that may take place in certain member states but not in other member states. And also a kind of criminalization which is taking place in the fisheries sector as well. And I think this isn't fair as well for those that do conduct fisheries in a proper and legal fashion. It's sort of these are some of the serious problems that exist, and I think indeed we need the necessary measures in order to deal with these issues and resolve them. Having said this, and also the improvement of data and collection of data, I do think it's very important in the sector to draw from the experience, the positive experiences that exist, and let's not forget that we have to draw from those who want to continue to thrive in this particular sector and to continue to be active in this sector as well. There are wonderful examples that can be taken. Also, with regard to the question that was posed here, and taking into consideration the management plans that were adopted during the previous legislature, well, some of the difficulties that arose, well, the differences, and of course the demands of one plan or another won't cause some sort of distortion or some sort of undermining of our being able to put together a proper regulation, a control regulation, which is effective. We have certain programs or plans that were adopted which had negative results, but we have the positive results as well that we have to continue to draw on. Now, over the last 5 years, drawing from that information and looking what we've done in the particular sector, and having read recently scientific reports which are posing questions with regard to the system, the landing system that's in place, well, what we've tried to do, we've tried to understand or sort of read through this carefully to try to understand what the objectives are, what the targets are. Now, as far as the quotas of certain vessels, and also the issue which unfortunately we haven't been very successful in, and that is sustainability, in other words, maintaining stock levels. So I think indeed we do need to include something in this regulation on control with regard to the absolute necessity, the fact that it's imperative to maintain stock levels. Sustainability is essential. Indeed, I think traceability from the moment it's fished to the moment that it's been put into its can and is consumed. I think there has to be absolute clear traceability. This is part of consumer rights. There are fish that are circulating and we don't know where they come from. And indeed, we have to have some sort of provision in order to protect artisanal fishing as well. Small-scale fisheries, in other words. A quality product is wonderful, but unfortunately, when this particular quality product from artisanal fishing, for example, ends up in some can or thrown together with other fish, it's a pity because we have no way up until now of tracing the origin of this particular fish. So indeed, I think we have to look at this as well, and the obligation of having proper labeling. This would protect the artisanal sector, the small fisheries, protect their production without having to compete with other products, which are not necessarily bad. There may be good products, those in fish in cans or fish in tins. But indeed, I, for example, as a consumer, would like to know what I'm paying for, and exactly what I'm getting. Now, we've seen, along with the Commission, that there's considerable fraud with numerous different types of cans and tinned fish, because we don't know what we're purchasing. We don't know what we're getting, and I think indeed that here we do have to focus our attention, and of course, indeed, we have to work together in a concerted fashion to do the best. But I do feel it is extremely important to do our best for small-scale fisheries and for fisheries overall in order to create a more robust sector. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. There are no other speakers. Mr. Miramon, you wanted to speak on behalf of Mr. Van Dalen?
Eso es, gracias. Es que Mr.
Thank you very much. Now, for family reasons, the colleague can't be here and has requested that I read on his behalf a very, very brief note. Now, of course, the control regulation, and I'll read what I have. And indeed, we have to work for a regulation which is better and more flexible in nature. Now, fisheries is extremely important, undoubtedly, and there are certain exceptions or derogations. There are derogations as far as discarding in the interior of the vessel right now in the particular control regulation which is in place, and I think this is really not the way to go. But in Holland, we feel that this creates major complications. Now, there are those discardings which take place in different parts of the country, and then they are transported to other areas, and the necessary logistics isn't in place, or the system isn't in place, or the machinery isn't in place in order to have a proper registering system with the disembarkation or with the landing, rather, of these particular fish at port. And I think it's very important for special attention to be paid to this issue, which is of considerable importance for Dutch fishermen as well. And the issue of sanctions as well. The Dutch are extremely strict as far as the effective implementation of control, but they frequently hear about what's going on in other countries where there are numerous different windows, where there's a lack of implementation of sanctions, and we find this extremely disconcerting. So we feel that it's very important to have a system of sanctions which is effective and which is implemented equally across the board. Thank you very much.
Presidente.
Good, thank you. Right, so I'll ask the Commission to... Oh, sorry, Mrs. Bilbao.
Disculpe, Presidente.
Excuse me, Chairman. Now, the Baltics and the Baltic area and management there in the Baltic Sea. Oh, well, actually, if I did make mention of the Baltic Sea, I meant the Adriatic Sea, actually. So, excuse me, it may have been a simple slip on my part. Thank you.
Thank you. Before the Commission responds, can I add a point or two? On the issue of cameras, if I recollect correctly, the Scottish whitefish fleet was fitted with cameras some years ago, and I think they got some increased quota by way of, encouragement. So there are practical questions about the whole camera issue, as Mr. Mian Mon has raised. And what were the results of that study? And can it be shared with us? I've not actually seen that. And one issue you raised was also the issue of reporting of lost fishing gear. How do you enforce the reporting of lost fishing gear, and what sanctions would you take against fishermen who lose fishing gear? And if they don't lose, if there's no sanctions, there's no point in getting the information, is there? And on the other hand, if there are going to be sanctions, why would they report it? Over to you, Commission.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for all the comments that have been made. They are all very well noted. I think at the moment there is not really time to go into detailed discussions on the certain aspects that have been raised. I note from many of the statements that indeed there is the perception that the control system and its implementation needs to be harmonized in order to ensure a level playing field, and that's basically one of the main intentions of our proposal here. We need to ensure that fishermen and fisherwomen are treated in the same way across all European Union member states. I have heard some concerns that the proposal might lead to increased administrative burden or to more burden for the individual fishermen. That's surely not the intention of our proposal. What we propose in particular for the small-scale fleet is not to mirror the same level of detail and technology that we apply to the larger vessels. What we want to have for the small-scale fleet are easy, cheap tools that can be easily handled by the simple fishermen and the simple fisherwomen in order to register their catch data. We are not coming up with exaggerated requirements for the small-scale fleet. We also know from our audits that where a paper-based system is in place, it actually generates lots of bureaucracy, because you have to transcribe all the written information again and again and again, with a lot of problems of causing errors in the transcription. So having a digital tool that allows to easily transform the data you get from a fisherman into the agglomerated information is less work-intensive, is less costly than the current system in place. And there are other examples I could give you for showing that we are not aiming at more bureaucracy or more costs in the country, and that's also for our own sake. Then on the criminalization of the fishing industry, again, this is not the purpose. What are we talking about at this moment? We are talking about the use by fishermen and fisherwomen of a common source. It's a common source that is available to everybody. So we have to make sure that the common source is used in a respectful and responsible way. And I think it's the good right of every fisherman and every fisherwoman to be ensured that his fellow fishermen and his fellow fisherwomen stick to the rules. And that's what this proposal is about. We want to ensure that everybody sticks to the rule and everybody can trust the others that the rules are respected. So the CCTV cameras are not a kind of criminalization of the sector. It's a way of ensuring that the rules are expected. I can assure you, as has been said by Director General Machado this morning, we will not intrude in the privacy of the operators. We will make sure that we respect the data protection rules. We will make sure that the cameras only are directed at those areas of the vessel where some activities take place, but not in the private areas. We will also make sure that the data are not constantly transmitted to everybody, but they are only being used for the purpose of inspections and controls. So that's what it is about. But we are happy to discuss all these things more in detail with you to explain the implications. And to come to your question, Mr. Chair, about the use of CCTV cameras here and there, we had in the past a couple of pilot projects in some member states for certain fisheries. And in order to do those pilot projects, member states here and there decided to give extra quota to have an incentive. We do have the results of those pilot projects. We can see whether we have a document that makes the results of the pilot projects easily available. One thing which is clear from the pilot project is that CCTV cameras are efficient in terms of controlling the landing obligation. And they are much more efficient than any other control tool we have been looking at. I wanted also to mention something because there was the request on who will pay for that. We have already now, under the current European Maritime and Fisheries Fund, we have a big budget of 680 million euro, which is only dedicated to financing control tools. And that can be used by the member states in the context of their operational programs. There's lots of room of maneuver under this envelope for further use under this current programming period. And also for the future, we have proposed that a significant share of the future EMFF budget can be used for control purposes, and approximately around the same amount. What you should also know that for the future EMFF, we have proposed that for small-scale fisheries, the aid intensity should be 100% for the investments in control devices. So we have ensured complementarity between our control proposal and what we propose under the financing tool. On the lost skier, Mr. Chair, of course, it's always difficult to ensure that data reporting requirements are complied with. There will not be a continuous monitoring that will indicate to you at every moment whether the reporting requirement has been complied with. That's difficult. Now, when it comes to sanctions for lost gear, I have to say not all fishermen throw the gear away voluntarily. They lose it in storms and so on and so on. I don't think it's you can apply a sanction for a mishap that is certainly not wanted by the fishermen and fisherwomen. Let me reply to two questions which were raised by Ms. Rose, I think. What do we do in terms of making sure that the member states implement the control system in a proper way? We are undertaking recurrent audit verifications in the member states to verify whether their control system complies with our rules. If we identify shortcomings in these verifications and audits, we take the appropriate follow-up action. And that can take different forms. It can take the form of a pilot project. It can take the form of an action plan. We have currently, I think, 11 action plans ongoing. It can take the form of an infringement proceedings, and it can take the form of an interruption of an EMF payment, or in the worst case, a suspension of the EMFF payment. And we do have cases where we apply these mechanisms. So there's a lot of work going on, and we really pay much attention to making sure that the member states' control system works. And let's not forget that we have also the EFCA, so the European Fisheries Control Agency, which really works very closely together with the member states to ensure that their control system is used in the best possible way. I hope I have reacted to most of the points. What I would like to offer from the perspective of the Commission at this stage is that we are all available to help you to understand better what is on the table, to discuss with you. So all our support is available for the next round of discussions. Thank you.
Why are you not proposing that the audits carried out by member states into the control rules are made publicly available?
Sorry, I forgot this particular point. It is true that we do not publish the audit reports. We do not have the habit to do that. We are happy to give an overview in a in-camera session because as long as we are having follow-up actions, we are not supposed to disseminate the information that is in part of the audit reports.
But why are you not proposing in this control regulation that it should be made publicly available?
It's a part of the TOMA report. No? In the TOMA report, there was. But this proposal, it's not part of our proposal, but I mean.
No, it's not. Why is it not?
Because we thought it was not considered necessary. But I mean, it's the hand of the co-legislators, so you can come up with whatever you want. Huh?
Fine. Are there any other questions? I think. Is everyone satisfied? Okay, thank you very much, Commission. Thank you for your presentation. Yes, indeed, and we will ask the Commission to make these studies into the experiments that have taken place into the use of cameras available to members of the committee, so we can make an assessment. Okay, can we move on to the next item, which is the series of fishing partnership agreements. If I can have some order, please. Oh, I'm going to use my gavel. I've not done that before. Thank you. So the fishing partnership agreements. For new members, you may know that these are agreements negotiated by the Commission on behalf of with non-EU countries. In this case, all countries in West Africa, and they allow for the payment for the purchase of surplus stocks that we caught by EU vessels in their waters. They are supposed to be sustainable. We call them sustainable fishing partnership arrangements. We hope they are, in fact, just that. We're responsible for vetting these agreements and approving them. And we ask the Commission now to make a series of presentations. We start with the proposed agreements with Cape Verde. And I would ask from the Commission, Mr. Mitalidis.
Thank you, Chair.
Right, there we are. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I have the pleasure to represent today Unit B3 and the head of unit, Mrs. Céline Idil, which unfortunately she is on a mission in a very important country dealing with negotiations. So I would like to start with the Cabo Verde. First of all, as a point of mention, we do consider that they are sustainable fisheries partnership agreements. We do have a totally revamped legal framework to support this, to be in full compliance with the common fisheries policy. So if we start with the protocol on Cabo Verde, this applies provisionally from the 20th of May 2019. We have a new sustainable fisheries partnership agreement that was signed on the 20th of May and covers a period of 5 years. It will enter into force on the day on which the parties notified each other on the completion of the procedure for the necessary ratifications. This is a rather old-standing, let's say, relationship that we have with Cabo Verde. The Sustainable Fisheries Partnership Agreement with the country started in 2009. We are now covering strategic, important areas in this particular protocol. It is, we contribute to the maintenance of the tuna protocol network in the Atlantic Ocean. Although this is a small, in terms of financial contribution, protocol is about 750,000 euros per year, the EU budget contribution. We believe that the agreement generates sustainable economic effects because of its high catches. The agreement and the protocol is also relevant because it places us strategically in the area, the importance of the West Africa Sea Basin for the EU fleets fishing tuna. The main aim of the new protocol is to provide fishing opportunities for Union vessels in Cabo Verde waters on the basis of the best available scientific advice and following the recommendations of the famous well-known RFMO ICCAT. This fisheries agreement offers to EU vessels the possibility to fish 8,000 tons of tuna and tuna-like species in Cabo Verdean waters, allowing EU vessels from Spain, Portugal, France to fish in these waters, and is part of the greater tuna framework fisheries agreements in West Africa. The protocol also provides, under its financial compensation, let's say part, support to the structural elements of fisheries governance, and it will play a crucial role in maintaining the fisheries sector in this country. The sectoral support targets, in particular, good governance, strengthening control, monitoring and surveillance, scientific capacities improvement, and support of coastal communities and environmental protection. There is going to be, as usual, a joint committee which will monitor the implementation of the protocol and the agreement and follow up the necessary steps to have it implemented and also to add, let's say, to the sectoral support. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mitralidis. Does anyone wish to speak? No? Okay. In that case, I can tell you now that if the coordinator's report is approved, then the EPP will prepare the report on behalf of the Parliament. We can therefore move on to the next of these agreements, which is with the Republic of Guinea-Bissau, which I think is, well, which would be insulting, but is interesting, particularly interesting in so much as it will be our third largest FPA, I think. Again, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Indeed, it is important. So Guinea-Bissau protocol applies provisionally as of the 15th of June 2019. It was a long process following 1.5 years of interruption of fishing activities in the waters of Guinea-Bissau because of the standby in negotiations due to political situation in the country. This now protocol, we consider it is crucial for the crucial and important for the EU fleet. It becomes even more important if we see the overall situation and its structure with the West African sea basin for the EU fleets, as I have already mentioned, for Cabo Verde. If properly applied, the protocol will be, we believe, a win-win situation for both parties, considering the longer duration, which is up to 5 years now, the inclusion of new category of small pelagic fish, and the transition from the existing system based on vessel capacity to a system based on catch limits, the famous known tax. The importance that the EU gives in the partnership with Guinea-Bissau is also underpinned by the significant increase of the financial contribution that amounts to approximately 15.6 million euros, out of which 4 million euros will be earmarked to support fisheries policy in the country. The Commission is committed to monitor the implementation of the protocol and to work closely with the authorities in order to put in place a transparent ocean governance fisheries management system. The activities to be developed under the sectoral support program will cover the improvements in fishery sectors in the country, and in particular with respect to control, monitoring and surveillance, improvements in the scientific capacities, and another important thing that we believe that it plays a crucial role is our contribution to the country's food security by foreseeing obligatory landings to the country for the local population. There is going to be, as in all agreements, a joint committee which will follow up closely and monitor the implementation of the agreement and the protocol. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Mitalides. Mrs. Bilbao.
Sí, gracias, presidente. Simplemente.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to thank the Commission for the efforts that they've made to ensure that this agreement would be signed. Both this agreement and the previous one are extremely important agreements for the European freezer fleet, Spanish and Basque in particular, where I'm from. They're going to generate employment in those areas, and also will generate employment and wealth in Europe as well. So just to emphasize that you have our support, and we'll also be able to improve the situation with regards to the quotas that go to the local population as well. Thank you.
Mr. Gonzalez.
Gracias, presidente.
Thank you, Chair. I'm from Galicia. I would also like to support this agreement. Fishing is more than industry or just a way of life. You have our support because the agreement with Guinea-Bissau that has been something that Spain has very much been looking forward to. 54 Spanish vessels, a number of Galician vessels are going to all benefit from this agreement. This isn't just good news for the Galician and Spanish fleets, but it's also good news when it comes to international cooperation with a country such as Guinea-Bissau. So all my support. And I would just say this new model to ensure food security for the country, or to ensure that more local fishermen can be involved, is also a very positive aspect of this. We'll continue to follow up on this agreement, but it's something that we do very much support.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ferreira.
Obrigado.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd also like to thank the Commission representative for their presentation. Now, these have been very difficult negotiations. That's probably the least we could say. It was a very difficult process. So I think really the main point we should be making is that it's positive that we would manage to achieve this at all, that we were able to see the different positions converging around the table, particularly from the part of the European Commission. The more consideration was given to what they wanted and the various concerns that were being expressed by the Guinean authorities as well. Now, we did have the opportunity to visit Guinea-Bissau. This was in 2016, so more than 3 years ago now. And I've been following the implementation of the previous agreement quite closely. Now we see what some of the shortcomings have been in the implementation of sectorial support. Now it is important that some of the concerns that have already been raised here were addressed with respect to the technical side, the cooperation, good control, inspection, vigilance. All of these various points are able to be addressed and taken into account. The ability to help the country with its capacities in these areas. Also, it's important that the European Commission has addressed concerns that weren't addressed in the past. This whole idea of mobilizing resources for sectoral support, and at the same time ensure better conditions in order to help build capacity within the sector. So basically working side by side with the Guinean authorities to ensure that the sectoral support really was being absorbed by the sector and having practical effects. I'm thinking, for instance, of infrastructure. I know that one of the concerns of the Ghanaian authorities, quite rightly I would say, would be that they wanted to be able to ensure that there would be a landing possible in the country's ports. And the Commission said, well, of course it was important to have the landings possible, but that the technical circumstances weren't present, that the infrastructure didn't permit it. So this basically was the Commission saying that they, over 3 decades, they'd been incapable over the years of the agreements with the Guinea-Bissau to, over all of this time, they had not even been able to ensure the necessary basic conditions for allowing landings in Ghanaian ports. And this is something that we really think the Commission needed to pay attention to. And that's what we've seen over the past 30 years. Things that haven't been done can now be done over the next 5. So I just wanted to flag that for the European Commission. From the Parliament side, of course, we will be trying to work within the framework of this opinion that we're preparing on the agreement to develop some recommendations for the Commission, looking at how they can further improve the implementation of this agreement at a number of different levels. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mimmo.
Presidente, yo solamente de forma muy...
Very briefly, I would just like to emphasize the importance of this report. After Morocco and Mauritania, this is the 3rd largest. The agreement was suspended for 2 years, and I would very much ask the Commission to look at what's been happening over 24 months up to the 15th of June. We're talking about 54 Spanish ships in the fleet, and mainly from Galicia, 26. And the cephalopod fleet is not going so well. So what we've heard here is really good news. A few words from Mr. Van Dalen. He's going to be the rapporteur shadow for the EPP. And I'd just like, on his behalf, to emphasize the importance of this agreement, both for the European fleet and for the local population of Guinea-Bissau. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Mitalides, can I just build on the remarks of some of the previous speakers before you respond? Fishing partnership agreements used to come in for criticism. It was often the case. It was alleged that the European Union was perhaps exploiting weaker nations. And we made revisions in the common fisheries policy in 2013, and they became sustainable. And you've emphasised some of the partnership arrangements in these agreements that are now being signed. Do you see a difference in the way these partnership agreements are being negotiated now as compared to 5, 10 years ago? And I'm also conscious, of course, that we are in competition with China and what have you in negotiating these agreements. How do we simply win by paying more money, or do we win because we are genuinely trying to address issues which are of benefit to us and to the nation with whom we are building a partnership? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much. To start with, we take note of the very good comments and compliments that parliamentarians have brought to the Commission for our work and our efforts to conclude the agreements. Of course, we do understand that it is important for the European fleet, as I have already mentioned. We also take very good note of the issues that the Honourable Member has highlighted with respect to Guinea-Bissau and the improvement of infrastructure and the lack, alas, of what has happened in the past 30 years. We do believe that the new framework that it has been established with the Sustainable Fisheries Partnership Agreement and the new regulation, the famous called SMEF, has helped us move quite a lot in the way we understand and our partners understand implementation. I think we have already mentioned that the Joint Committee will be looking very attentively on the implementation of the agreement, not only to the benefit of the European industry, but to the benefit of the local populations, which is, of course, a very important element. Now, Chair, your more general, I would say, comment on what we are doing with the Sustainable Fisheries Partnership Agreements. We do believe that we have moved away from mistakes of the past. That's why we have actually, after a long process of preparation and deliberations with the two co-legislators, arrived in the adoption of the SMEF regulation. Our guiding principles are based, our basis, our Bible is the common fisheries policy, and the common fisheries policy is clearly setting out that we have to achieve environmental, between other things, environmental sustainability. We are also building our intervention to the basic principles of the international law. We are not going there to take away things that are in short demand. We are only exploiting using the surplus of what is available, and this is in line with what UNCLOS and the United Nations Fish Stock Agreement is asking us to do. We are having a full transparent system in place so everybody can have access of the information that we are basing our deliberations and on how we are actually removing these stocks from the coastal states' waters. And I do believe that this is totally different vis-à-vis other nations or other fishing entities, that they don't necessarily follow the same approach. We are following a totally non-discriminatory approach in the way our industry is accessing into the market. We are having very, very targeted and well-based ideas of what we want to help the third countries, the coastal states, to do, especially with control, monitoring and surveillance and improvement of scientific advice, and on the basis or on our endeavor to fight illegal fishing. So all in all, we do believe that we are really the good guys in the area. Thank you.
Nice summary. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to the third of these. And so over to you, and we're talking here about Gambia.
Yes, so the last thing that we would like, or the agreement protocol we want to present, is the agreement with Gambia. The fisheries agreement between the European Union and the Gambia is one of the old creatures, I would say. It was first signed, I believe, in 1987. And since then, the last protocol was in 1996. On the 11th of October 2018, negotiations were concluded with the initialization of a new agreement and protocol with the country, fully aligned with the principles and objectives of the European Union Common Fisheries Policy. The new agreement includes fishing opportunities for tuna, bar seiners and poly lines, and hake. One of the main elements included in the new agreement is the improvement of ocean governance. For this, we have used our, let's say, power of convenience of convincing the country concerned to become a member of ICCAT, as this is a legal obligation set out in the new SMEF regulation, which requires that our partners, our members, need to be members of the corresponding of the relevant regional fisheries management organization. Among other objectives, the new agreement with the country is aiming to help deter IUU practices, fishing only the surplus, and taking decisions based on the base scientific advice in order to improve fisheries management. The new agreement between the EU and the Gambia will also serve as an instrument to help the local economy. We believe it will create jobs and consolidate the new political leadership in the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Madam Roos.
Microphone, please. Although the agreement is mainly focused on tuna, it also has provisions for deep water demersal species, and that's what I'd like to look at. How can we ensure that EU fleet activities doesn't disturb local fishing, and how far were local fishing communities consulted during this procedure? Then on the measures, the proposed measures, are they sufficient when it comes to data collection and monitoring? And fisheries at sea, and also the results have shown that deep water fish, well, are they being sustainably managed, and are people being properly trained to carry out the tasks that they need to do?
Are there any other contributions? Right.
Microphone for the chair, please.
In the past, it's sometimes been said that the European fishing fleet arrives, it makes arrangements with a government where governance, honest governance, is not necessarily uppermost in the minds of those in power, and local fishermen lose out because the big European fishing fleet takes all the fish. But that's not happening anymore. You're promising us. Do respond.
Okay, I will respond to the technical questions regarding hake, the demersal species. Any negotiations start with what we call an ex-ante evaluation, which has a thorough look at science. We would then fish for hake if the science doesn't back up the possibility to tackle or target these species. The local population, and I mean there are no local fishermen that target hake. This is also one of the reasons why we fish for hake or for tuna, because none of these species is targeted by local fishermen, otherwise we wouldn't. How are we going to guarantee that the resource is going to be sustainably fished? First of all, we know that we can target it because there are scientific reports from SECAF, which is a sub-regional organization that provides scientific advice that has proven the viability of fishing hake. And the monitoring of these fisheries will be done via the SECAF Scientific Committee, but also via the Joint Scientific Committee. We are going to have not only a joint committee, but also a scientific committee that is part of the monitoring of these agreements that are mixed or partially mixed, as is the case of the Gambia. Observers, there is an obligation in the current agreement to have a scientific observer on board of each of the 2 vessels that are going to be able to fish for hake in the country, plus the obligation to have a percentage of the queue of local fishermen. So these are hopefully the technical answers to your questions.
Thank you. Are there any other contributions? Okay then, so my thanks to the Commission representatives for your presentations. I hope good guys is a gender neutral term that we can all enjoy and embrace. Thank you. Keep up the good work. So there now will be a short break while we just check if the Commission representative is here for the next debate. We're a bit early. He's coming. Okay, 3 minutes. So we'll start again at 16:05.
Depending on the type of fish, you have the same move. Yes, that's what
they are moving the fish.
Yes, they are
moving with the fish, basically.
Exactly. So
that's my IUU years. That's why I know why this math is good.
But what is that? Because his question was like, if the EU vessels, they are going there to fish everything, and the percentage for EU vessels fish is quite small.
This is criticism from...
You know very well because of the... But the percentage, for example, in Morocco, the percentage of what
Which
we
is the
have
biggest one,
is a
no?
very
It's
big
the biggest
one. It's the biggest one. The percentage of what EU vessels fish is very small compared to Russia, which is China and Morocco. So
themselves.
So this question is like you don't. I mean, if you show the figures, it's clear. You see, but anyway, this is.
Honestly, I thought there would be, I mean, especially the chair, I thought there would be more aggressive. I was expecting positive for the bilateral.
Because he's from Britain, so they are totally against.
I thought it would be more aggressive in the sustainable fishery partnership agreement. It was not
Well, I think when he just mentioned the point right from the beginning, he targeted
The so-called.
the so-called. That was.
If you could do me a sentence for your, I think yours is more substantial.
I will do the.
So you can
I
send
mean, it
it
was
to
in
me.
the defensive because I was expecting. I included the defensive because I knew that it was going to come.
Really hate. Στέλνουν στη διάφορα χωρίς να υπάρχει λόγος. Δεν είναι κανένας που το γίνει. Και μου έκανε με το έχει κάνει όλα. Και μετά μου λένε αφού δεν εσύ δεν κάνεις και αυτό γιατί το μόνο της Ελλήνης είναι...
Ναι, καλά. Βρήκα κάποιον που έχει τελειώσει. Γιατί εγώ ψάχνω κάποιον για τα διεθνή θέματα, για το UN και τέτοια να βοηθήσει.
So please take your seats again. Okay, thank you, colleagues. You'll know that yesterday the Commission adopted emergency measures for the conservation of the eastern Baltic cod. You'll know that ICES published a report in May on advice that the state of the cod stocks was, well, very poor, critically poor. So let me hand over to the Commission. Mr. Fries, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. And let me start by introducing myself. I'm Bernhard Fries. I'm the Director for, amongst other things, Fisheries in the Atlantic, North Sea, Baltic Sea in the GMARE, European Commission. So as you just said, the Commission adopted yesterday emergency measures to stop directed fisheries on Eastern Baltic cod. This follows from a scientific advice that we received at the end of May from the Intergovernmental Council of Fisheries Science, ICES, which basically alerted us and the countries concerned to the critical state of the Eastern Baltic cod stock that had been in decline for a while but has now reached a point of very severe decline. The findings are essentially, as the scientists tell us, that the stock suffers now from an unsustainably low biomass. So the spawning biomass, the number of fish that is necessary to reproduce the stock. And therefore, the capacity of the cod stock to actually continue existing, reproducing itself, is now put in peril. The causes for this are of course not certain, but likely to be in the area of both environmental factors, in other words, in plain language, pollution in the Baltic Sea, and changes in the ecosystem that in all likelihood are linked to climate change. In that situation, of course, a fishery as it has been conducted adds fishing pressure. The fishery may not be the root cause, but certainly adds to the state of the stock. The spawning stock biomass is now at its historically lowest level, and the overall biomass is as low as it ever has been in scientific observation. The emergency measures essentially follow a procedure that is set out in the CFP regulation of 2013, as you know. They do basically one thing. They order a halt of directed fishery of the stock, on the stock, and in doing so, they try to be as proportionate as we can be in that situation. So we have included the Commission has included a number of exemptions for those kind of fisheries that are accessory, that are not targeting the stock, and that are of a very limited impact. These are essentially three categories. These are coastal fisheries in waters close to the coast, shallow waters in the middle area of the Baltic Sea, the so-called Area 24. There are bycatches of pelagic fisheries that don't target the stock but target other species, and they are within a certain threshold fishing activities by small-scale vessels. The incidence of these catches is in the low single digit of the already very reduced catches of the cod stock in that area. So these measures will stay in place until the end of the year. As you may also know, we have received again advice from the ICES about the recommended fishing opportunities for 2020 onwards that are not encouraging, and the prospect on the whole of that stock are not good. So we believe that these measures are the best precautionary way of trying to make sure that we can, hopefully, but not with certainty, help rebuild that fish stock.
Well, I'm open to people wishing to speak, but can I just ask? Oh, good. Okay, good. Can I ask a first question, which is just how many fishers are affected immediately by this ban? And by affected, does that mean they have to tie up their boats, or does it simply mean they move to different fishing grounds? And then I'll give the floor to my Vice Chair, Mr. Gard, and then to Mr. Herbst.
Okay. The fisheries on the Eastern Baltic cod stock are, of course, have a certain regional center of gravity. Not all 8 Baltic countries are fishing the stock to the same extent. Some more, some less. Those that are mostly concerned are those of Lithuania. Our figures show us that of the total Lithuanian fleet, around a quarter depend on the eastern cod stock. In some segments, these are many more. That's up to 90%. So that can have a significant impact. Similar but less severe for the Polish fleet. I'd be happy to give you quite precise tables about how many vessels and full-time equivalents are concerned if you need that. I'd be happy to pass that on to the Secretariat.
So these boats will be tied up, or do they simply can they move to other fishing grounds?
it's not obvious for all of them that they can move on to new fishing grounds. So I would say that quite a number of them are actually tied up. And what is more important even perhaps is the long-term prospect. If you have a fleet or a fleet segment that relies on fishing a specific stock, and that stock is unlikely to recover for quite a while, that of course raises economic questions. I should also say that under the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund, there is the possibility for national governments to assign financial support to those vessels and vessel operators who are affected by a temporary closure or by prohibition to fish. These possibilities exist. They have not been fully used, so there is a window of using these possibilities under the EMFF regulation still in all the countries concerned. And we have been in touch with them, of course, to try to make it easier for them to use that opportunity if they wish to do so. These are decisions that are not taken here in Brussels. They are taken by the respective governments.
Thank you. Can I turn to you? My colleague, I recognise that my Danish pronunciation is non-existent. You'd have to tell us. I do not.
My name is Søren Gade and I'm from Denmark. And of course, this is serious because I'm from this country where this actually has an effect. And we discussed it before, and this is a decision that will affect hundreds of families and their way of living. And I must say that if we look into the ICES report, they have assessed that if you made a total stop for all fishing for the eastern cod, it will, and I quote, "is estimated to result in only a 4% higher spawning stock biomass in 2020. So it is obvious that the eastern cod has a problem. But what I think is you could consider is that some part of those areas you have actually now restricted. If you take the western part of subdivision 24, ICES, they also state that here is the proportion of the eastern cod to be low. So I think you have to take into consideration. Of course, we should take care of the cod in the eastern part, but I think the area that's actually more or less closed is too big, and I will ask you to consider that when you look into what's going to happen, both now but also after 2019, because this will affect, as I said, a lot of fishermen in this area. So I will urge you to look into this subdivision 24. Thank you.
Let's just clarify that. This is an emergency closure, and therefore that lasts for 6 months. But the proposal will be that, you know, from the scientists, that there be no TAC for the foreseeable future. This is a permanent closure until you achieve what you optimistically describe in the report as a rapid return of the stock to above MSY levels. Is it not?
Chairman, yes, that's correct. So this is an emergency closure that will last indeed until the end of the year, at which point the new fishing opportunities regulation will kick in. That needs to be decided by the Council of Ministers, as you know, in October. As such, you're also right in saying that the scientific advice clearly tells us that the emergency measures, if we stop fishing now, will have a limited impact, but they will have an effect. We consider that the situation is so dire that even a limited improvement is worth trying to achieve. We have tried to structure the measures in a way that is proportionate, so that tries to limit the side effects on fisheries that are not directly fishing cod through the 3 exemptions that I mentioned in my presentation, because it would perhaps probably be disproportionate to, you know, take away or to stall fisheries that have a very, very low bycatch rate. And on your point on Area 24, the science tells us, if I'm correctly informed, that around 75% or 3/4 of all cod catches in that area are taken from the eastern stock, so the stock that we're talking about here. So if you take a precautionary approach and you take the area as a whole, which is something we have to do, it seems that this is the right approach. The emergency measures cover, in fact, all areas 24, 25, 26. So we have not included the more northern wards areas of the Baltic Sea where there's very little stock. So that's another way of trying to really be targeted. And as I mentioned, we try to, in Area 24, exclude those that can be, in an operational way and in a controllable way singled out, which are those that are close to shore and in shallow waters. So that's as far as we can go now. But as you rightly say, the real and more long-term discussion needs to be had very, very sincerely when we analyze the advice for 2020 onwards, and which, as you rightly say, is zero catches, and when we enter into the discussions in the Council where this needs to be decided in the end.
Thank you very much. Just a small remark again, but ISIS also said that this, in the western part of this area 24, there is not the eastern cod stock is not there, as I read it. And then another point, as you also said, I mean, all this will inflict a lot of people, and it is less than 4%. So I'm just saying, if this is going to be the way to deal with these issues, there will be other parts in Europe that will be hammered in the years to come. So I think it is important to look into it a kind of holistic way. There's also other things that can be done, not just to close and remove people's living, so to speak.
Come back in a moment, please, Commission. Mr. Herbst.
Ich möchte das ausdrücklich unterstützen, was
I'd just like to expressly support what my Danish colleague has said. We can't just worry about the east. We need to think about all of the competition pressure towards the west that this measure will cause. I'm sure we'll be seeing more fishers heading towards the western Baltic now as a result of this. And they'll be wanting to fish the western stock. And this will have ramifications. So my question then really ties in with what my colleague just said a moment ago. Shouldn't Area 24 have been treated maybe differently? And that would have maybe reduced that pressure? I think it's good for the eastern Baltic cod, this step, and I also very much welcome what the Commission representative said about possible exemptions or exceptions. But we do need to ask ourselves, not just because of proportionality, but whether there's some sort of possible discrimination involved that could lead to complaints, say, against vessels of a larger size. My question maybe would be whether the Commission could explain how they intend to deal with this and whether there's any legal protection against this complaints of discrimination. Thank you.
So, Commission, possible shift from east to west, and that just puts pressure on the western stock, and possibility of, we're favouring some fleets, some countries over others.
Yes, thank you for these questions. So on the question of a possible shift onto the western cod stock, as you know, the western cod stock has its own history of troubles. In that case, probably caused more by overfishing than by the very dire environmental conditions under which the stock suffers from in the eastern area. The quotas for the western stock have been reduced over the years to be in line with what is still responsible level of fisheries. Of course, these quotas exist, and so it is not possible for a fisherman coming from another area just to sail to the western part of the Baltic Sea and fish on a different stock. They need to have quota for that, and the quotas are in our fishing opportunities regulation in line with what is precautionary MSY-based fishery on the western stock. So if you have quota, you can fish. If you don't, you can't. That's a bit the simple reality of that situation. On coming back to the question of how to handle Area 24, I'm very happy to go with you into a more detailed reading of the ICES advice that we requested. Actually, we requested very specific advice for these emergency measures as well, on top of the regular catch advice. We read it slightly differently. We think that it's difficult in an operational way to distinguish between parts of the western part of of that area and the eastern part. We think that if we have even only a limited opportunity now of improving the size of the spawning stock biomass at this point of time, we need to take it, and the most precautionary thing is to actually close the fishery in the whole area. But very happy to go into the detailed line-by-line reading of the scientific advice, which is a quite substantial document and very technical. So we have, of course, asked for specific advice. We have analyzed it. We discussed it with fishery experts in the member countries concerned, and that's our reading. That's what the Commission has adopted yesterday.
Eine kurze Nachfrage.
Just one quick follow-up question. All of the quotas for the Western, would be, for instance, the Polish or the Baltic countries, are they fully exhausted, or could they possibly be considered? Are there any quotas left over?
I would think, but I have to check that. I'm happy to get back to you, that the quota of the Western cod will be fished out. I mean, we're of course in the middle of the year, right? So there's still half a year to go, and I don't think that the fishermen who can benefit from these quota will leave a lot over in the current situation anyway. So that is simply the distribution of fishing quota, which traditionally have in the western part of the Baltic Sea benefited countries like Denmark, Germany, Sweden, and in the eastern part of the Baltic benefited Poland, Lithuania, and other countries, with some smaller parts of the quota also on the respective other side in each case. So I'm afraid that there may not be very much flexibility, but that's an informed guess more than a 100% reliable answer now. There may not be very much flexibility of shifting quota to other recipients. But if you wish, we can check that and give you a precise figure again of the current quota uptake.
That would be welcome. Thank you. Can I ask, you allow a bycatch of up to 10% cod, I think, for fishermen seeking other stocks, prey. How do you enforce that 10%?
Yes, so this concerns one of the three exceptions. So there's an exception in favor of small-scale fishermen below a certain size of the vessel. That is a matter of controlling it is a matter of fisheries control, which is ensured by our member countries, and each member country has its own control authorities and control mechanism, and of course we will encourage them and make sure that this is being controlled and monitored. But that's the same as applies for any quota uptake across the board.
Well, perhaps the final question for me then is simply, you've introduced emergency measures. The expectation is that you'll be recommending to the ministers that this be extended in the new year and there be a total ban on the fishing of cod. If you did not introduce these measures, what would happen to the stock?
So in the now hypothetical scenario that the Commission would not have adopted the fisheries closure as we have it now, as it was adopted yesterday, if you read the scientific advice, we would have a slightly more negative evolution of the spawning stock biomass. So what the ICES has told us is that the stock has already difficulty in actually reproducing itself. The size of fish that you find is very small. It's no longer a cod like this, but mainly juveniles. Apparently juveniles can still spawn to some extent, but it's very erratic. So we would have a few percentage points even worse situation than we have. We are in a bit of, if I may use plain language, environmental crisis here. And I would, if I may allow myself, come back to what you said about looking at the systemic aspect of this. We are in a situation where we have a declining fish stock for quite a number of reasons. that not even in the first place have to do with too much past fisheries, but with pollution and with probably a good degree of good dose of climate change. And what we are trying to do is to make sure that this fish stock has, in that very difficult situation, the best possible opportunity of replenishing itself without actually going into a catastrophic decline that might eventually lead to the complete loss of the cod stock in the Baltic Sea.
Yes, Mrs. Keller.
Thank you. I actually would like to ask especially about this, or explicitly about that, because, I mean, you're talking about giving a break to cod for a couple of months, which is not much looking how disastrous the situation is. But then, of course, the question is what happens afterwards. I mean, all these factors, the environmental problems, they will not go away within a couple of months. So what's your plan in order to follow up and make sure that the overall situation improves for the cod? Thanks.
Okay, I mean, this goes slightly beyond my professional brief, but I'm happy to attempt an answer. Climate change, you know, you have to tackle it very, very quickly. By the way, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, the IPCC, will issue a report on the oceans and the cyrospheres being the frozen part of the Earth, so the poles and the high mountain glaciers, in September. As you know, what we know from reading the draft is that it's not going to be good news on many fronts. So this phenomenon of declining fish stocks, or fish stocks migrating away from where they are, which is of course difficult in the Baltic Sea because it's a closed sea, is something that I'm afraid we'll have to get used to. We are right in the middle of these effects of climate change already. If you read the draft of that report, the public will be able to read it in September. So if you ask me what to do, is to take very, very urgent and severe measures to address climate change is the very first thing. Secondly, address the pollution in the Baltic Sea. And that, again, is something that spans beyond my department. Of course, it's something that needs to be done on a wider scale. But I think it spans also, if I may allow myself saying so, the remit of this committee. Maybe the issue should be discussed in the Committee for Agriculture or for Environment, actually. So if we look at the phenomenon, it calls for a systemic approach. What we can remedy here with these emergency measures is, in the first place, actually the fisheries component. And I'm afraid to say that this is probably in that case, not in all cases, but in that specific case, one that is not even in the first place responsible for the decline. So there is a lot to do to try to prevent these kind of disasters from happening.
Well, you've used the word disaster and catastrophe. It's not our job to make life easy for you, of course. And of course, there's issues of pollution and climate. But you also talked about the size of the cod. And now, you know, I'm no expert, but I thought cod didn't reach its full fertility until it was about 7 years old, and therefore of quite a size. So if we've got to the point where we're catching fish virtually before it's had a chance to reproduce, why haven't we taken action before now?
Yes, you're right. So actually cod matures slowly. It's a long-living species. It needs to reach quite a number of years to be fully reproductive. Doesn't exclude also that it can reproduce at younger age, but of course much more sporadically, less reliably. What have we done in the past? We have tried over time to reduce the fishing intensity of the cod stock in the Eastern Baltic Sea as well as in the Western Baltic Sea. You may remember that 3 years ago we reduced the quota for the Western Baltic cod by, I think, was it 60–70% in one go, just to bring it in line with what was apparently a rather severe situation of overfishing. We have done so last year in the Council. You also know that the eventual decisions on fishable quotas, on so-called TAC, total allowable catches, are taken by the Council of Ministers and not by the Commission. The Commission has each year put forward a proposal in line with scientific advice. The Council has sometimes taken a decision that was slightly different for reasons that I'm not going to comment on. But again, the point that we also learned from the ICES advice is that apparently the root cause of this decline is not entirely in the domain of fishing opportunities, but it is also due to other factors which are to be addressed in different ways, some of them in a very complex way. And so the actual fisheries management is one tool we have, but not the only one.
Thank you. Unless there's anyone else who wishes to come in. I think we've explored that quite exhaustively, but I think we also, Commission representatives there, you know, again, those words, catastrophe, disaster, you know, we don't want to be here again. It's really important that the Commission speaks up early, and if ministers or anyone, this Parliament's ministers, are not taking the action that's necessary, then, you know, at the very least, you've got to speak up very loudly, because we just don't want to be here again. Thank you. Thank you. Well, in that case, thank you very much indeed for your presentation. Yeah, are you? Yes, indeed. The next item is concerning IUU fisheries. And because we don't want to give away any secrets, this will not be web streamed, and I have to ask members of the public to leave the room now, as this will be held in camera. So we'll take a couple of minutes break and resume again in 3 or 4 minutes.